This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. What a fun conversation today. Ken Blanchard, American author, management expert. His extensive writing career includes over 60 books. His most successful book, The 1 Minute Manager, which I'm sure most everybody listening has read. That one sold over 13 million copies. Absolutely amazing. Anyone who listens to this podcast knows that I really love having guests on that have seen lots of time on this planet. Because the wisdom, it just comes through. It just exudes in their voice. And that's right there what we have with Ken Blanchard. I'm forever fortunate to keep learning myself. And man, if I can keep having teachers like Ken Blanchard, maybe, just maybe, I'll get a little smarter. Without further ado, let's jump right in. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ken Blanchard. Ken, let me jump right in and go back in time a little bit. I imagine into the early 80s, you release your book, The 1 Minute Manager. But before that, talk to me about an event or a time period in your life, perhaps as a teenager, an experience with family, something that when that book came out and it became a hit, that you knew that some of those early experiences, perhaps an early experience in your teen years, really helped set that foundation. Because I think it'd be fascinating for people to see, for someone who's had such a noted career as you, where was the start? Because it just doesn't happen. There's a lot of building and iterations and steps on top of steps. Where did it all start for you?
Well, it was interesting. I had an amazing father who retired as an admiral in the Navy. He was my leadership coach. I had an interesting upbringing. I went to a 95% Jewish elementary school, and on Jewish holidays they put us all in one room, and then we merged in junior high school with a 95% African American elementary school, which went to the Supreme Court in '61 to test the neighborhood school, and I kind of won all the elections as a compromise candidate, and I won the president of the 7th grade, and I was all pumped up, and I came home. It was my first entry into junior high school, and I told my dad, he said, "Congratulations, Ken, but now that you're president, don't ever use your position." He said, "Great leaders are great because people trust and respect them, not because they have power." That was the beginning of my leadership training with him, and so it was really interesting. And so the 1 Minute Manager was really kind of one of those God things, because Margie and I met Spencer Johnson at a cocktail party, and he wrote children's books. He wrote a whole series called Value Tales, the value of honesty, the story of Abe Lincoln, the value of determination, the story of Helen Keller, and the value of sense of humor, the story of Will Rogers. And Margie met him first and hand carried him over to me and said, "You guys ought to write a children's book for managers. They won't read anything else." So he was working on a 1-minute scolding on how to discipline kids, and I invited him to a seminar, and he got all excited and laughed and came running up at the end and said, "Forget parenting, let's do the 1 Minute Manager." And since he was a children's book writer, and I was a storyteller because my father taught me how to speak, he said, when you work with a group, you need to make a point, tell a story. Make a point, tell a story. Don't just make point after point and point. You put everybody to sleep.
Can I keep you at your father for a moment? Because the way you describe it initially, your father being an admiral in the Navy, that's something that for most Americans, they don't grow up with that experience. My father was in the Navy during the Vietnam War, but he was a dentist. He was not anywhere near that type of leadership position. I would love for you to give a little bit more, to the extent that you can or you want, about your father, because it's a really interesting, it's a For people that are not familiar with the American military, that's up there. I mean, that's a lot of work to get to that position, many, many years. Can you speak to your father a little bit more, perhaps the influences upon you?
What was interesting about him, he's one of those, what they call great Americans, because he grew up at West Point, where the military academy is, where the Army officers are trained, and his father was a doctor there. And when he got out of high school, his dad said, "I think you should go away to school, son." And he just loved the West Point, and he said, "Well, if I can't go to the Naval Academy, to West Point, I'll go to the Naval Academy." And so he ended up going to where the Navy officers are trained. It was really quite an experience. But he graduated in 24, and World War I ended in 22. That was really kind of a time where they didn't need a lot of naval officers. So after his senior cruise, they let him out. January 25, he goes to Harvard Business School and he gets a master's in finance, an MBA in finance. He goes down to Wall Street and works starting with Anaconda Copper. Then he went with National City Bank. They're about to make him a vice president, and he comes home at 1940. I was 1 year old. Said to my mother, "Well, I quit today." She said, "You did what?" He said, "I quit." She said, "To do what?" He said, "I rejoined the Navy." She said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "Well, didn't I tell you if the country got in trouble, I thought I owed it something, and Hitler's crazy and the Japanese will be in this pretty soon." And so he goes from potential vice president to a second Louis, and they put him in Brooklyn Navy Yard. Pearl Harbor happens in December 41. Looks like he's going to stay there because he's 40 years old with no experience. So that was my dad's style. So he called one of his classmates who had stayed in, was the top guy at the Bureau of Personnel. Said, "John, what do you got for an old guy with no experience? I got to get in the action." And he said, "Let me check, Ted." And he called back a couple of days. He said, "All I have with a guy with your experience is a suicide group going into the Marshall Islands." And he said, "You got your man." He, of course, didn't tell my mother, but they gave him 12 LCIs, these landing craft infantry that went right into the beach and protected the Marines and the frogmen, which are the SEALs today. And about 70% of his men were killed or wounded, and somehow he survived, but was decorated off with kind of things that he did. And he came back and went back to National City for a couple of days, and he came home and told my mother, "Well, I quit again." She said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, a bunch of draft dodgers there." So he stayed in and kept on moving up in rank, and made a whole career out of it. But late, because the wartime bumped his ranks up, because they had to bump him up to give him 12 ships. They made him a commodore, and then he made him a commander, and then up the line. But he was an amazing guy, tremendous integrity and values. He said to me, "Ken, that when all is said and done, all you have is your integrity, your word." He just was amazing. And he said, in terms of my work in servant leadership, he said, "Ken, it's a myth that in the military it's my way or the highway." He said, because if you acted like that, he said, you were in battle, your men would shoot you before the enemy. He said, I was only as good as the chiefs that I had, the people around me who had all the information and could guide me. And he said, "Don't think like all the brains are in your office, And so he kept on working me.
How do you think he was, at least as you tell the story, he sounds very even-keeled. A lot of things change in his life. He moves from one thing to the other. He's going down the Navy path, stops, gets back on the Navy path. But speak to that even-keeledness, because I see it in you too.
He really taught me that in life, you never know what might happen, and you got to be ready to go. Like, you want to hear a fun story about me. When I was an undergrad, I got interested I was running a dormitory as a student, as a kind of a resident advisor, and so I got interested in student personnel, being a dean of students, and so that's why I went to grad school, and it was interesting. But all my faculty members, when I was going through my master's degree program, then I said, "I'm ready to go to be a dean." They said, "Well, you need to get a doctor's degree." And I said, "Doctor's degree? How am I going to do that? Those people are really bright." And so I found that graduate school is more endurance than it is intelligence. A lot of people couldn't make it because you get hit a lot, and you have to know whether you're going to get up. And my dad always told me, somebody hits you, get on up, get on your feet and get going again, don't stay down there and moan and groan. So when I got out of school, they said, if you want to be at a university, you should be an administrator, not a faculty member, because you can't write. So my first job, I ended up being assistant to the dean of the business school at Ohio University. And when I got there, he said, Ken, I want you to teach a course. I want all my deans to teach. And Paul Hersey had just arrived at Ohio U as the chairman of the department. He put me in Hersey's department and gave me a course in management. Well, I had studied leadership and management, so that wasn't any problem. And after a week or so, I came home and told my wife, I said, man, this is what I ought to be doing. I ought to be teaching. This is fabulous. She said, well, what about the writing? Because, in universities, if you don't publish, you perish. And I said, I don't know, we'll work that out. But I heard Hersey taught a great course. In December 1966, I go up to him and say, Paul, do you mind if I sit in your course next semester? He said, nobody audits my course. You want to take it for credit, you're welcome. He walked away, and I thought that was really something. But I found out later that he just felt if you audited, you wouldn't do anything, He was really something. So I ended up taking his course and writing the papers. And in June 1967, he comes into my office. Ken, he said, I really would love to have you work with me. He said, they want me to write a book, and I'm kind of a nervous wreck. I'm not so good at that, but I've been looking for a good writer like you. Would you write a textbook with me? And I said, wow, that ought to really be fun. You're not supposed to write, and neither am I. So we ended up writing a textbook. It came out a year or so ago, and the 10th edition probably sells more today than it did then. It was really an interesting journey.
Let me jump you ahead a little bit and get you closer to 1982. Your life really probably starts to change dramatically. I mean, maybe your way you carry yourself and the way you think, but in terms of that probably stays the same, of course. But in terms of notoriety, in terms of people knowing what you're doing, your influence on a larger population, this starts to really change with the release of The 1 Minute Manager in 1982, right?
Yes, for sure. What really happened is, who would have ever thunk it, we were a couple of unknown guys. We met in November of 1981 and had a draft written by the time we went to the Rose Bowl in December. And people loved it. And I said to Spencer, let's go to New York and get a contract. He said, no. He said, they'll beat us up and take all the money. They don't know us. He said, we ought to self-publish it. So we ended up self-publishing the book ourselves before we went to New York. And we sold 20,000 copies with no advertising.
So hold on. So when you went to New York, you had a lot of leverage after selling 20,000 self-published.
Yes. And well, at that time, nobody had written any real parables for management at that time. And Spencer and I loved Jonathan Livingston's Seagull and The Littlest Prince, and Og Mandino's The Greatest Salesman and all. That's why we thought we'd write a story. He's a children's book writer, and I'm a storyteller, so let's write a parable, We didn't realize what an impact that would have, because people were tired of reading long books. And you get a kick out of this. Year before, all the bestsellers were about Japanese management. And I think the U.S. market was just tired of that. What about us? The 1 Minute Manager came out at the same time as Tom Peters and came out with In Search of Excellence, and John Nesbitt came out with Megatrends, and the three of us dominated the bestseller list. The business books had never done that.
Let me ask, were you able to, I assumed, but having pre-sold those copies before going to New York, were your conversations and your negotiations different when you got to the big publishers in New York City? Did you truly have some leverage?
Yeah, because we had a track record. We already had endorsements from corporation presidents, and so we were at a different kind of league. But it was funny. We were selling the book for $15.95, and it wasn't even 100 pages long. And one of the publishers, no, the price is too high, and Spencer would kind of get up and go to the door and look at these people. He said, this must be Little League, because if two unknown guys can sell 20,000 at $15.95 and you can't, we got the wrong publisher. And when we got to William Morrow, when he gave his little speech, the president of Morrow, Larry Hughes, jumps up and says, lock the door, don't let him out of here. He's absolutely right. We got to figure this out, We put a little thing on the front of the book that said, small, expensive, but invaluable. Just so people knew that we knew it was a high price in those days, but that was a hardback for $15.95. Today it'd probably be $25 or $30.
Let me ask about the title, because this is an interesting title. I think even for today, if someone has not yet read the book, or if they hear the title, 1 Minute Manager, that brings up ideas in people's craniums that they probably get it wrong just instinctively, because the title doesn't tell you what it really is. So talk to me about the development of the title and perhaps any confusion that you saw early on were people debating the title with you?
No, well, Spencer was working on this thing called the 1 Minute Scolding with a psychiatrist. When he came running up after that, said, forget parenting, do the 1 Minute Manager. And we thought, wow, that's really neat, because what really sells books is to intrigue people. And you say, the 1 Minute Manager, well, how could you manage in a minute? I'd really like to see what they have to say about that. And I think the title was on our on our radar really well.
Why don't I let you go ahead also, for the audience that has not yet read, or those that need a reminder, there were really 3 very key, simple secrets that really drove your book. Why don't you speak to those?
We kind of looked at, what are the key things to managing people? And the first one was 1 minute goal setting. All good performance starts with clear goals. If people don't know what you want them to do, how are they going to end up doing it? 1 minute goal setting was the first secret. But once goals are clear, we thought you ought to wander around and see if you can catch people doing something right and accent the positive and give them a 1 minute praising. I tell you, of all the things I've ever taught over the years, if somebody said to me, Blanchard, I'm going to take everything away from you, but one thing, the one thing I would hold on to is 1 minute praising, because I think that if you want to build a great organization or have great people, you got to catch people doing things right.
Yeah, and you were talking about the 1 minute praisings, and is that something that to not take away from you?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's just so important, So many organizations, I ask people, how do you know whether you're doing a good job? Nobody's yelled at me lately. No news is good news. Unfortunately, the biggest style around the world is what I call seagull management. The manager's not around until you make a mistake. Then they fly in, make a lot of noise, dump on everybody, and fly out. Not a really fun place to be. And so I think if you're in an environment that accents the positive, people want to be there. But if people make a mistake, you shouldn't ignore it. We said the third secret is the 1 minute reprimand. Now, we've rewritten the book recently, a couple of years ago. We changed that to 1 minute redirects. But either way, it was really saying to the person, here's what I've noticed about your performance. It's not up to the what we agreed upon. And I want to know if you're noticing that too. And I'd like to see if I can help you get back in line. It's really more of a redirection than a reprimand, but Spencer really kind of liked the concept of a reprimand with his 1 minute scolding.
Ken, speak to the time component here. 1 minute. Speak to the shortness in terms of praise or reprimand. Now, I think instinctively we would all think, well, gosh, nobody wants to be reprimanded for longer than it has to be. 1 minute sounds good to me. 1 minute praise also, well, that seems a little more less instinctive because, well, hold on. If somebody wants to give me praise, I'll take it for a lot longer than a minute. Not necessarily a good idea, huh?
No, it's just, how long does it take you to really notice, somebody and say, I just want to tell you, I just noticed what you do, and boy, it really made me feel good, and I just appreciate your efforts. And you don't want to go on and get super gushy, but you want to be specific, tell them what they did right, but you don't have to, do that. And so you could wander around and give a number of praisings because Tom Peters always said the key to being a great manager is to manage by wandering around, I think the myth about how long it takes to reprimand or redirect somebody and all, it's just it's a myth. It doesn't have to be a long one, but as long as you're specific, It was funny. I had one guy that at the holiday season now, he would go around his company and shake hands with everybody in the company and just say, just appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot. And he would go on to the next person, appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot. And he got sick one day, one holiday season. He couldn't make the round, so a guy put a mask on and went around and said to people, appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot, and all. And everybody just laughed because it didn't have any meaning, because he didn't know anything about what anybody was doing, It was just kind of like a shower. You got to be specific, and when you're specific, that's really powerful for people.
Let me take a big picture for a moment and get away from some of the specifics. I'm going to bring you back there too in a moment. But big picture, great managers are trained, not born. I see this in my field too, in the investments field. People wonder about great investors. You can even think of somebody like Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger. It all is about training. I think across all disciplines. If you ask people about natural talent, or if there's such a thing, it seems like the vast majority of people reach for, well, that guy is a natural investor, or he's a natural manager, or he's a natural athlete. But you speak to the idea of training. And I think it's something that as a society, we've all gotten a little messed up on, that if you really want to go down the path of any path, and you push and push and push, and you practice and practice and practice, you can excel. How do we get that all wrong?
People say, are good leaders born or they made? It's a combination. I mean, I will say some people, like my dad, just had a natural flair for people. He loved people, and he could bring out the best in them. Now, he said he learned.
Who did he learn from, though, right?
Yeah. Well, he learned at the Naval Academy.
There you go.
Most of us really could use some training. I think people need to, first of all, know what leadership is, practice it, wander around and try to do it and model it and all. And it's a journey. So I think training can really help people, and you can become better. We have a master's degree program at the University of San Diego, and it's in leadership, and the students are all in their mid-30s and higher, and they say, wow, I wish I had learned some of this sooner, because a lot of times we assume that a good performer, somebody's a good salesperson, will be a good sales manager. That's not necessarily so, because that's a completely different trait. Being an individual contributor is different than managing people. That's where the training has to come in, and so people can see things differently. I
would love for you to at this moment to give a little perspective on constant learning, because we're covering some decades here, and you've never stopped. You just keep going, and you keep learning, and you keep growing. And the question I have is why?
I wrote a book with Norman Vincent Peale, wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. He was 86 years old when I wrote with him. I was in my early 40s. Norman said, if you stop learning, lie down and let them throw the dirt on you because you're already dead,
I love it.
And I just never forgot that, because he was learning right up to when he died at 95. And he's been a great inspiration for me. I'm 78 now, and people said, when are you going to retire? I said, why would I retire? I'm having too much fun. I'm learning too much stuff and all. And I just think that I wrote a book with Mark Miller, was the head of training at Chick-fil-A, called Great Leaders Grow. And we just were arguing because we've just really seen that the best leaders we've seen are people who are constantly trying to get better and learn. And I think you need to. I wrote a book recently called Refire, Don't Retire. Make the rest of your life the best of your life, And I was on the phone when I turned 65 with, remember Zig Ziglar? Ziggy invited Margie and I to the 69th anniversary of his 21st birthday or something. And I said, Ziggy, you going to retire? He said, there's no mention of it in the Bible, except for Jesus, Mary, and David. Hardly anybody under 80 made an impact. He said, I'm refiring, not retiring. I thought, wow, that really is powerful. And so I ended up writing a book about that. And what's so interesting is I thought it mainly would be for senior citizens, and they were giving it to all their kids in their 20s and 30s who they thought were getting in a rut. And it was really exciting. I just think it's so important to learn, and In the Refire book, we look at 4 areas for learning. What are you doing to grow intellectually with your mind? That's really important. What are you doing to grow physically? Keep yourself in shape and all that. What are you doing spiritually? Because you ought to, get out of your own way and realize maybe you're not the most important thing in the world. And then finally, what are you doing around relationships? It's a constant thing of keep on refiring yourself, and so I'm really excited about refiring. My wife, is a little year younger than I am, but she used to be president of the company, and she stepped down a number of years ago because I came up with a belief with a guy from Europe who I was writing a book with, Terry Waghorn, that you really have to do 2 things in organizations. You have to manage the present and create the future. And you make a mistake in an organization to send people who have present responsibilities off to plan your future, because they'll kill your future because they're either overwhelmed with the present or have vested interest in it. You ought to have a separate group that's in charge of the future. So my wife stepped down as president. She got a think tank of group that had no operational responsibility. A full-time job was to study our industry, study technology, and all. And so it's been tremendous advantage for us over the years. When 9/11 happened, a lot of our competitors had real problems because they only did face-to-face training. Well, we knew all about online training and all kinds of stuff because of the Office of the Future. So that's that. And so she's an amazing learner. She's always, turning another rock over.
It's one of those reminders that everyone needs to hear, that somebody that is a few years older has never stopped. And so then if somebody's much younger and they say, I've learned enough. No, you haven't. You can't stop. If you want to compete with the best, you got to keep going. That's the way it works. I've got this, I've most recently gone through your book, Self-Leadership and the 1-Minute Manager. And there's 2 quotes in there that I love. They kind of connect. An assumed constraint is a belief that limits your experience, and not realizing your own power could be your greatest assumed constraint. Why don't you first talk about the notion of an assumed constraint?
We kid, and the environmentalists have been picking on the elephants in the circus and all, but it's really interesting, when they first get an elephant, they tie him up to a stake and a rope, and the elephant tries to pull and can't do it. They're not strong enough. And now the elephant's huge and thinks they can't pull the stake up. They could pull that stake out in a heartbeat, but it's an assumed constraint from the past, And I think that's what you have to do, is you have to watch the messages that people give you, that they, kind of label you what you can do, just like people saying, I'm sorry, you can't write. And that was a consumed constraint until I realized that was stupid. How do I move through that? Rather than not being able to write, that's just become one of my favorite things. I think assumed constraints are often, messages put in your head by your parents and other adults when you were young. So that's where it all starts. And once you got that under control, then we say, well, most people are afraid to ask for what they need to win because they don't think they have any power. They assume that if the boss has power, a coach has power, and all this kind of thing. They don't realize that we all have power. If people like to be around you, you have personal power. If you're good with technology, you have technical skill and power. And if there's a whole bunch of. So we try to have people look at what kind of power bases they have and how do they increase them. And then finally, the last one is, how do you ask for what you need? We use our situational leadership model to help them analyze what's their development level and how do they get the help that they need to succeed, And so it's fun. I use that on my own health. When I got Joy, and she was such a joy in my life, this dog, and I realized that she's small. She probably lasted 16, 17 years. And by the time that was, I'd be 86, 87, and she gets so excited, she can tell my car's coming down the road even before I get in here. She comes racing down the hall, and I didn't want her to be racing down the hall, and I wasn't going to be there, A lot of people say, Blanchard, you're something. Most people worry about losing their dog, not their dog losing them. So I decided to get myself in shape, and I went to a guy I'd met at West Point. It's one of the heads of their whole physical fitness training, and he told me that there's 6 parts of healthy lifestyle. And, one is aerobic, what are you doing for your heart? Then there's strength training. Then there's balance, flexibility, diet and weight control, and sleep. And so I went through and looked at what was my development level, and the only one I was fully developed on is sleep. I can sleep at the drop of a hat, But the other ones, I had to look for somebody who would give me the leadership style I needed. So, like, I had never done anything with strength training, so I needed a lot of direction and supervision. In aerobic, I had been in a lot of different jogging programs and all, and so I really needed somebody to support me, and I needed a walking partner, a running partner. You got to do it. We say to people, if you ask somebody to help you and they say they can't, they didn't turn you down. They just turned your proposition down. Nobody can turn you down without your permission. Eleanor Roosevelt said that years ago. Nobody can make you inferior without your permission.
It's so beautiful to hear just that common sense wisdom. And you just say it and you hear it. It's reminders that we don't hear in everyday society anymore. In everyday society, all we hear about, if you turn on the news, is the latest who knows what crazy behavior of some politician or some Hollywood person did. That's all we ever hear about. We don't hear about the common sense good stuff.
That really is a problem, I think, in our country, and I think around the world. You don't ever hear any good news. And some people say it's our fault because we don't want to listen to good news, but I did a session recently for a group called First Tee, and they teach kids in urban areas about character and values through golf, And they've impacted in 20 years 10 million kids, and you should have heard the stories that I heard from these kids about what's happened in their life. I said, how come I never heard of this thing? What a great new story this is.
Wouldn't it be nice on the nightly news, the ABC, NBC, CBS, instead of starting with the daily news of whatever, just start with that story? I think people would love it.
Yeah, we love the Sunday morning news, CBS morning news, with that good gal, because that's all that is good news. So we watch that before we go to church. Jane Pauley runs that, but it really is true. Even in our country now with President Trump, he's got some issues and problems and all, but nobody's caught him doing anything right.
Yeah. Let me shift you into, Ken, as we wind down. We've only got so much time left. Self-leadership. I can tell you something about myself. I'm in my late 40s, 50s soon, and I'm a guy that grew up at the start of the internet. So right there when Netscape was going public, I was like, okay, I'm just getting out of grad school. I've got nothing. I'm putting up a website. Boom. So my thinking all along has been this entrepreneurial thinking, not be associated with a large company. And I have to say, there was probably some hesitation in me in diving into your world because I thought, well, gosh, why is this going to be useful for me? Because this is more large corporate management leadership. I dive into your world and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we all need, regardless of whether or not you're self-leadership or whether with a large company. It's what we all need.
I think people that don't admit that they need this have an ego problem. I started a 12-step Egos Anonymous program, where people get focused either in false pride where they think more of themselves than they should, and they're putting people down, or self-doubt and fear where they think less of themselves than they should, and they're kind of cowering and all that kind of thing. And I just think that, as we were saying earlier, if you stop learning, you're in trouble. You just need to open your mind and say, and that's the same way. The great leaders I've seen, I wrote a book with Colleen Barrett, who stepped in to be president of Southwest when Herb Kelleher decided to step down. And she has a great saying. She said, Ken, people admire your skills, but they love your vulnerability. And to admit that you don't know everything, that you could learn something. I mean, rather than people saying, God, he's the leader, how come he's so dumb? They're going to go, wow, isn't that great? Now I can make a contribution and all. And Brene Brown, who's a really big person now in our country, she did a TED Talk on vulnerability. And God, I don't know how many millions and millions of people watched that thing to realize that being vulnerable is not a weakness. It's actually a strength. In fact, she says it takes courage.
It's a fascinating path you've gone down. I would love for you to reach back into the memory banks. I know you've had a chance to inspire so many people with your wisdom, your vulnerability, your content. But are there any particular people? They don't have to be a well-known name. It could be somebody, because I know with your type of career, you've shifted other careers. You've allowed people to build off your work and go in directions that perhaps they didn't expect if they had not come across your work. Are there any great stories or individuals that you can recall that you really feel so proud that they, or happy that they found you, they found your work, and then they took it and they built off it and went in such a great direction? Look, I know it's more than one person, but I'm curious if you've got any in mind that might be fun to share with the audience.
I started to work, and we started to work with Ken Chenault, president of American Express, when he wasn't president. And then the minute he became president, he continued to work with us. In fact, when we would do a new sermon or a new seminar or learning experience, he'd always be the first one in the first row. And he's just retiring now, and everybody's saying, God, he's got to be one of the great CEOs of all time. And I think it's not because he got trained by us, because he got trained by a lot of people, but his openness to learn and to realize that he still could learn new things and all that. I mean, he's one that really kind of stands out on me. And he African American, the probably highest ranked African American CEO in the country, and just unbelievable openness to learning. And I think that's a really exciting stuff, and look at Herb Kelleher and Colleen Barrett from Southwest. They were always open to new learning, and there's no accident that Southwest is the only airline that's made any money over the years. A lot of people don't know they're 87% union. It's the biggest union shop in the country. But when they were going to vote on unions, they came to Herb and he said, God, I love unions as long as they let you sit on the same side of the table from me. Is if they want you to sit in the opposite table, vote against them. And the union leaders are there at every meeting I've ever been, even voting to salary cuts to deal with the gas crisis. And, I just really see them, as models of saying, well, I don't know anything. I need everybody. I need all of you to be the best. I just love of that stuff. I've worked with Wegmans grocery chain. They were chosen the number one company in the to work for in the country by Fortune, and just amazing. I was asked to speak when the founder stepped down and his daughter was going to take over, and at her first big meeting, and the founder decided not to come. He said, I don't want to take anything away from her. She's in charge now. She's the leader and all. I mean, how many people would do that, The absolute best leaders are the ones that Greenleaf, talked about. Robert Greenleaf, he said that they serve first and lead second.
Ken, I have one final question, and it's kind of a wider issue beyond America. We mentioned in the beginning of the conversation Singapore, and I know your books have been translated. I think the number I'm seeing most recently is 42 languages, but it probably goes up every day. I would love for you to kind of contrast and compare. I find, having been outside the States for multiple years, I find in some of the growing, vibrant cities around the world, I find an energy that sometimes I think we as Americans, maybe we've dialed it back a little bit, because I find the enthusiasm in some really growing areas outside the States. It's quite amazing. I'm curious if you would talk about the acceptance of your work outside the States. Obviously, I mentioned the translations, but the personal experiences you've had with the acceptance of your work.
I was on a program one time with Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, and he's a perfect example of managing consequences, because he had a vision for Singapore, what he wanted that country to be, and he said, here's our goals, and here's what good behavior looks like, and I don't want our streets to be all messy and all. So if you litter and you're caught, it's a $500 fine. If you don't have the money on you, you go to jail. He was, and yet when people were really good, he would praise them and all that kind of thing. It's just that's why 1 minute goal setting is the first secret. You need to set a vision and a goal of what, and then catch people doing things right. And if they don't do it right, then redirect their energy. And I've just been amazed every time I've been in Singapore about what a wonderful place to be, and the positive energy in that place, and a lot of different nationalities and all living there, and it's just great. So when you see that in a country, it's really exciting, you know, and so I think that's the kind of thing that we need more of.
I find when I talk with my Singaporean entrepreneurial friends, it's the closest kinship that I have in terms of that business conversation than with Americans. I mean, they're right there, if not beyond. You bring up Lee Kuan Yew, something, a cool point for people to check out. There are some old black and white Meet the Press interviews that you can find on from NBC on YouTube, where he's speaking in the 60s. Fantastic oratory, just great.
Yes, unbelievable, you know. And you see that, like take Rwanda, where they had this genocide, you know, and 20 years ago, and then they got a different leader, and that whole thing is turned around. You know, Rick Warren's over there, and all kinds of things. I mean, that's becoming one of their goal is by 2025 that they might be, you know, the Singapore of Africa. You know, just change the leader. Look at Colombia was really a problem. Then they got a new leader, and Colombia's just really turned around tremendously. You know, and the leader has got to be somebody who has vision. And also, it's not about them. They're not building themselves up. You know, it's interesting. Jim Collins, when he did his study at Good to Great, he studied 25, or, you know, a bunch of companies that we found were really great companies, and hardly anybody knew the leader, the president. You know, it wasn't about them. It wasn't the Iacocas or the others that, you know, are out front all the time. It's really interesting to see that, whether it's in a nationwide or in a business-wise, that the leaders who have vision, and it's not about them, it's about the people they're serving. What a difference that makes.
Ken, I can't keep you. I could ask you questions all day long. You need to go enjoy that San Diego sunset, hang out and relax some. But I appreciate you taking the time today. Great stuff. We covered a lot of wide territory. I'm most appreciative. Is there a place, Ken, for the books everywhere, Ken Blanchard, Amazon, you're going to find a ton of reading there. A best website that people can go to, Ken?
So we have a new website called KenBlanchardBooks.com. Yeah, a lot of people will say, God, I'd like to see all that. We got them divided, whether you're interested in customer service or self-leadership or team leadership.
Are you still keeping track of how many books you've written, Ken?
Well, other people are, but I haven't paid attention. It's supposedly over 60. But
60?
My mother used to say, why don't you write a book by yourself? And out of those 60, I've only written 2 by myself, one on golf, because so many people helped my golf game. I didn't know who to write it with. And the other one was my spiritual journey. But I'm a learner, and I just love to learn from other people. So every other book I've co-authored with somebody, and so that's just a delight to me. I have a book coming out in March. It's probably the best thing I've ever done. It's called Servant Leadership in Action, and I got 41 people to write short articles about what servant leadership meant to them, from people like Marshall Goldsmith and, you know, Frances Hesselbaum, who ran the Girl Scouts, and all kinds of great people, Kuznets and Posner, and even Dave Ramsey, and just an amazing group of people who are Lencioni and all that. They did it because I'm a collaborator. I'm not a competitor. So it's really fun. It's coming out in March. And I think the world is in desperate need of a different leadership role model. And I just hope that this is a movement, not a book. And the royalties are all going to a servant leadership foundation where we're trying to build energy to send it around the world.
Well, Ken, you're a great inspiration, and I feel fortunate to have had you on. And if in the future, if you would ever like to have another conversation when the Servant Leadership book comes out, I'd love to have you on again.
God bless.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.